We are going to start our lunch today hearing from Professor Michalyn Steele. She graduated from the Georgetown University Law Center in 2001 and subsequently joined the faculty of BYU Law School as an associate professor in 2014. Following 2 years as a fellow and a semester as a distinguished practitioner in residence at the law school, she taught federal Indian law, evidence, and civil rights. After beginning her legal career with Sonosky Chambers, and then multiple other names of law firms, a highly regarded DC firm. This is why we don't like law firms that have a billion names, right? But it is a highly regarded DC firm that specializes in the representation of Native American tribes. Professor Steele worked for 6 years as a trial attorney in the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and she's also worked in the Housing and Civil Enforcement section, where her primary responsibilities included litigation and investigations to enforce the Fair Housing Act, Title II of the Civil Rights Act, and the RLUIPA. While at the Department of Justice, her work was honored with the Division's Special Act Award in 2006 and the Division's Special Achievement Award in 2007, 2008, and again in 2009. Beginning in late 2009, Professor Steele has worked for several years as a counselor to the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, Larry Echohawk, at the U.S. Department of Interior. She's a member of the Seneca Nation of Indians of New York, and Professor Steele holds a bachelor's and a master's in humanities from BYU with an emphasis in English literature and Native American studies. Ladies, please welcome Professor Steele.
I learned from Senator Marco Rubio's response to the State of the Union, you should pre-pour your water. So, it is truly a pleasure to be here today. I was talking to a colleague yesterday, and they asked if I had any plans for the weekend, and I said, I'm going to the MWIG conference, and I'll be speaking. And she said, Amway? I said, no, MWIG. And so I'm really glad I'm not at an Amway conference today. I'm sure their products are lovely, by the way, but it's a great honor and a humbling assignment to speak to you. I'm keenly aware of the work that so many of you are doing and have done to defend the rule of law and the dignity of each of God's children as our nation and our democratic institutions have faced critical challenges over the last few years. I've watched you speaking truth to power, making your voices heard, holding our elected officials to account for their votes and policies. I've read your op-eds defending the humanity of immigrants and the freedom of religion for every creed. I've seen you engage on Facebook and other fora to reject bigotry in your communities, and doing so in a way that models civility and kindness without a spirit of contention, and that is no small achievement in that forum. So I'm honored to be among a community of women who've chosen not to shirk the hard work of citizenship and democracy. And that work, especially the leadership and the legwork of women, it seems to me, is needed now more than ever. I believe there is a kind of a war for the soul and future of our nation. If our democratic institutions and the rule of law are to endure, we must step up and speak out. So I recognize that any of you could stand here and offer significant insights and wisdom from your experiences about how we might more effectively meet this historic moment, and not just meet the moment, but to do so the way the conference theme suggests, through peacemaking and politics, and to leverage the influence of women in the public sphere. We don't generally associate the tasks of peacemaking and politicking together, but we have covenanted and indeed been charged as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to be peacemakers in the model of the Savior, even in the midst of turbulent times. And our duties as citizens of our nation and communities give us additional, somehow related task of asserting our influence in the public sphere. And I think we can do it. We can't everyone do every bit of it, but each of us can do something. And that is why, as I look at you and meet with you today, I'm inspired by what we can do as individuals and as a collective, as we magnify our individual gifts and offer them up. And we combine our energies to make things better. So thank you for being here and wanting to be part of this great effort. I've wondered what I might add to the panels and plans of the day. If it's going to be me standing here during your lunch, what is it that I should say? So I offer my faith and hope in you, in our institutions, and most importantly, in the Lord, and suggest some strategies as we chart our course for whatever is to come. As was mentioned in the introduction, I'm a member of the Seneca Nation of Indians of New York. Grew up there till I was 12, living on the reservation. When I was 12, my mom decided to come to law school here at BYU and change the course of our family's life by gaining that legal education, and magnified her gifts so that she could serve clients, and particularly building rule of law-based institutions, helping to shore those up among the tribes that she worked with. But being a member of a tribe means that I know what it is to be part of a tribe, to feel named and claimed, to feel connected, and to feel a sense of obligation to a cause greater than self. I feel the sacrifices of those who came before and who laid the groundwork and planted the seeds of happiness that have grown up, that I have reaped where I have not sown. And so I honor and remember those who came before me and on whose shoulders I stand. The Seneca Nation was part of the great Iroquois Confederacy. It was a political, cultural, social alliance that brought together originally the 5 tribes of the Iroquois, the Seneca, the Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. The Seneca are the westernmost. They're called the Keepers of the Western Door. In what is presently called New York State, there was imagined a great longhouse that sat over that area, and the Senecas were the keepers of the Western Door there. There's a creation story about how that political alliance came to be that I want to share just a brief version of with you today. Iroquois society was in deep crisis. There were wars, skirmishes, murder. The murder rates were very high. People were killing each other almost for sport. The society was devolving. People had forgotten, in some instances, even how to mourn the dead. They didn't even bother to bury the dead. They were losing the sanctity of life from their vision. Some leaders recognized the peril that was facing their society as it devolved into chaos, and they sought the help of a man who had 7 daughters to be more engaged in civic affairs. And he said, "I'm too busy. I have 7 daughters. I can't engage. They're keeping me very busy." And just to illustrate how devolved the society had been, how confused their values were at the time, they hatched a plan that if they would kill his 7 daughters, then he would be free to help with the affairs of the nation. And so they killed his 7 daughters. But instead of freeing him up to engage with civic affairs, instead the loss made him insane with grief. He stopped eating, he stopped bathing, he stopped combing his hair, and he just wandered in the forest, devastated, as you can imagine. He would run into people as he wandered, and people couldn't tell what was wrong with him. Are you hungry? Are you cold? They couldn't see that it was grief that he was carrying. As he wandered, and he could see that people couldn't recognize grief, that the society had fallen to the point where they, in some ways, were not recognizing the cost of human life, the value of human life. He began to think about what he would say if he saw someone in that kind of pain. And he thought that there would be words that they could say and actions they could take that would begin to help him heal. He imagined the specific words that he might say to someone who was bearing such a great burden of grief, and he began to compose a kind of ceremony of condolence. Around the same time, there was a man born in the north. We call him the Peacemaker. And he could see what was happening, and he said that he wanted to go on a kind of a mission and tell people, teach people, that peace was better than war. This was a principle that had been lost in the society, that peace was better than war. And so he set out to teach people his belief that peace was better than war. And as he wandered, he happened into the man who was grieving. And he could see immediately that the man was insane with grief and that he had suffered a tremendous loss. And then the Peacemaker began to say the words that the man had imagined would be comforting and healing to him. He cleaned him up, he fed him, he combed his hair. And then the words he spake, together they developed the ritual of condolence, which helped the society relearn how to mourn properly for the dead and to value an individual human life and what its loss means to the community. In the ritual, the Peacemaker spoke the words of healing and peace. He took what is called in the ritual the white fawn skin of pity, the softest thing you can imagine, to wipe the tears from the sufferer's eyes so that he could see the sun clearly again. He cleared his ears so that he could hear the laughter of children again. Grief had clouded his eyes, the tears had clouded his eyes and had caused him that he couldn't hear the laughter of children. He said he knew that after suffering a great loss, your throat closes up and it's hard to swallow or taste food. And ritually, he opened his throat for him so that he could eat and swallow. That one rings particularly true to me because I know when you suffer a great loss, it is hard to swallow. Your throat does close up. One of the things we learn in this story of the creation of the founding of the Confederacy is that the right words can help individuals and societies to heal. Once the Peacemaker and the other man were been healed, once his grief had been spoken, the two traveled together to share the message together that peace was better than war. They went on to found the great Iroquois Confederacy. The message was well received. They instituted a ritual to help found the Confederacy, where they uprooted the tallest trees, and in the gaping hole that was left, everyone in the community would throw their weapons of war, and they would be buried, and then they would replant the tree, and that the tree of peace then became a symbol that anyone could find comfort and refuge under its shade. They established what's called the Law of Peace, which is come to be known now as the Iroquois Constitution. One aspect of the Iroquois Constitution that you might find interesting is that representatives were sent to a deliberative body, and there were a couple of mandates that they had. One was that they were not allowed to act in self-interest. If they acted in self-interest, it was grounds for removal from office. And who could do the removing? Grandmothers. Clan mothers, grandmothers, held the power to remove any delegate from office who was not acting in the best interests of the community. What do you think? Time for a constitutional amendment? We don't need that amendment in our Constitution because we as women, as citizens, we do have the power to remove from office those who are not acting in our best interest. It's called the vote. And since 1919, the Constitution protects the right of all women to that sacred franchise. We just need to mobilize and use it, right? We can say no to self-interested acting politicians. As a Department of Justice attorney, I was assigned to help monitor an election on the Navajo Nation. And we were trying to ensure that the counties where the Navajo Nation was in Arizona, in particular in that election, were providing adequate interpretation for primarily Navajo speakers of the ballot. And in one precinct one day, I saw a very elderly Navajo woman who had walked in the hot sun for many miles to be able to vote. Unfortunately, she was overcome by the heat of the journey at the steps of the precinct and had to be taken to receive medical attention before she could vote, at least while I was there. I don't know if she was able to vote or not that day, but I have never forgotten her determination to do so, even at great personal cost, and the efforts of those who came before and sacrificed to give us access to the ballot. I hope we never take it lightly. I think of her, and I think of Amelia Boynton Robinson and John Lewis, who were beaten by law enforcement as they crossed the bridge at Selma, Alabama, marching to demand the right to vote, that franchise be extended to all citizens. And for daring to assert that right to vote, law enforcement beat Ms. Robinson and John Lewis severely. I think of the people of the Spirit Lake tribe in North Dakota. Just this last election in 2018, in November of 2018, there was a law that got passed in North Dakota that seemed to be targeting the Native people in that state. It's a very red state. The pockets on the tribe tended to go blue. And I think as a political matter, they passed a law that said that you had to have an ID that had a street address on it in order to be able to vote in North Dakota. Well, most of the tribal citizens in North Dakota don't have street addresses. They have P.O. boxes. And so this was a way of having a disproportionate impact, even if it was not intended to be so, on the Native people in their voting. So a group of lawyers was organizing to go observe the vote. To essentially what we were trying to do is gather evidence for a lawsuit that would come if the tribes were in fact denied access to the ballot. And I have a very gung-ho colleague, Kif Augustine Adams. Many of you may know her. I kind of call her the four directions woman because she goes in all four directions to do what needs done. And she left from that observation of the voting there. She went with me to Spirit Lake, and then she had to go fly from wherever we were in North Dakota down to the border in Texas to help inspect some of the facilities where they were detaining young migrants. And so anyway, so she was there. She and I went to the Spirit Lake tribe. But this irrepressible human spirit, right? The yearning for freedom and the unwillingness to have your voice silenced was instructive for me. The tribe there, although they only had a couple of weeks, they thought the law might be struck down and they'd be able to vote. They went ahead and got the machinery, got the information, assigned everybody on the reservations a street address, and reissued tribal IDs so that people could vote. They were printing those little ID cards even on the day of the election. And the people of the Spirit Lake tribe broke all records of prior elections. Knowing that some of their fellow North Dakotans did not want them to vote, they showed up and voted. I think of Harry T. Moore. He worked for the NAACP, and his primary responsibility in Florida in the 40s and 50s. He died in 1951, so the 40s. He was registering African Americans to vote in Florida 2 decades before the Voting Rights Act was passed. And because of his efforts, on Christmas night, 1951, they placed a bomb, dynamite, under his bedroom, and he and his wife were killed on Christmas night, 1951. The poet Langston Hughes memorialized this assassination in a poem called The Ballad of Harry T. Moore, and I'll share a short excerpt from the poem. It could not be in Jesus' name, beneath the bedroom floor. On Christmas night, the killers hid the bomb for Harry Moore. It could not be in Jesus' name, the killers took his life, blew his home to pieces, and killed his faithful wife. It could not be for the sake of love they did this awful thing, for when the bomb exploded, no hearts were heard to sing, and certainly no angels cried, peace on earth, goodwill to men. But around the world, an echo hurled a question, when? When will men, for the sake of peace and for the sake of democracy, learn no bombs a man can make keep men from being free? It seems I hear Harry Moore. From the earth his voice still cries, no bomb can kill the dreams I hold, for freedom never dies. I will not stop, for freedom never dies. I will not stop, freedom never dies. So I think of Harry T. Moore. I remember a couple of years ago, I had a migraine and it was primary night, and I just did not want to get up off my bed and go vote. And I thought of Harry Moore, and I thought of the Navajo lady, and now I will think of the Spirit Lake tribe, and I will get myself to. I went and voted even with them. That was when the lines. If any of you from Utah County, the lines were craziness. I think it was the 2016 election. That was great to see. Another important, just to wrap that up. So I think, let's vote. Let's register others to vote. Let's give rides to the ballot. Let's organize and do everything we can to defend the sacred right of ourselves and of others to vote. Another important principle in the Iroquois Constitution that we might remember together in our current generations is called the 7 Generations Principle. Leaders of the Iroquois tribes in the Confederacy were responsible under the Constitution for the consequences of their choices on the next 7 generations. They had to think about that and take responsibility for how their choices as a deliberative body would affect 7 generations. It requires governing councils to consider the long-term effects of their choices and to eschew, I'm not sure how, I can write that word, I don't say it often, eschew short-term political gains for sounder, more lasting policy. How might such a principle change the political and policy calculus of our decision makers? How might it change what we demand of our elected officials? The 7 Generations Principle. And I see a lot of what you're doing in terms of shoring up the institutions of democracy and making sure your voices are heard as preserving for the next 7 generations the blessings of liberty that we have claimed for ourselves and established and ordained in the Constitution. The next thing I want to talk about is to think about how we might be the voices of peace and healing for those who are suffering, and how we might ease the grief of the sorrowing in the same way that the Peacemaker did. We know that there is a great power of healing and peace in words, and so having someone speak our sorrow or just listen to our sorrow, and using our voices as advocates in expressing empathy and in speaking truth to power, just as the Peacemaker's word lifted the crippling burden from the suffering father, our words matter. This is a part of a much broader Native American tradition, the sacredness of words, the power of words. In many Native creation stories is that the world came into being because the Creator spoke it, that the part of the Creator's power of creation is that he spoke it. When we speak, it's as if we give birth to truth, to empathy, to accountability, or we may, in essence, father lies, cruelty, and contention. Such is the power of words. In Genesis, we're told that God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. In John, we're told that in the beginning was the Word, a title for Christ, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. What tremendous power we hold and responsibility we bear for what we speak and bring into the world. A key power of peacemaking is speaking peace. When the Nephites were under siege in the city of Manti, they had exhausted all their stratagems for luring the Lamanites out of their strongholds. And although, this part always makes me laugh, although they did get the Lamanites to sally forth sometimes, and I'm not totally sure what sallying forth means, but because it seems a little mincy, but they did get them to sally forth, but not enough that they could engage a battle and end the war. This group of Nephites was desperate. They were hungry. Their food was dwindling. Their cities and their liberties were under dire threat. And we're told they poured out in Alma 58, they poured out their hearts in what is the most sacred and effective speech, prayer. After their prayers, 58:11, Alma 58:11 says, "The Lord our God did visit us with assurances that he would deliver us. Yea, insomuch that he did speak peace to our souls, and did grant unto us great faith, and did cause us that we should hope for our deliverance in him." So in response to their pleas, this most efficacious of speech of prayer, the Lord spoke back, and he spoke peace, and that gave them faith and hope. I saw some of this, even in dire circumstances. I saw some of this really remarkable faith and hope, even in dire circumstances, a few weeks ago when I went with a group of students to Dilley, Texas, where there is a family detention center, women with small children who have been apprehended at the border, who are being held in what is essentially a prison, and getting ready for their asylum credible fear interviews. Asylum is a high legal hurdle. It's not easy to obtain, but people have a legal right to ask for it if their lives are in danger in their country of origin. And so these were people who, having been apprehended, asserted their right to asylum. You have to be in the United States to seek asylum. You have to physically put your feet in the United States in order to seek asylum. And so these are largely women and children who have fled their country of origin and have to pass the first step, which is a credible fear interview. Not a hearing, but an interview where an asylum officer assesses whether their fear is even a little bit credible, and then they can go on to make their claim to asylum. Usually they're released from the detention with an ankle monitor so they can make those claims. So we spent the week there as volunteers for something called the CARA Pro Bono Project, helping women get ready for that credible fear interview, helping them know what parts of their story were legally relevant for the hearing officer, or the interviewer, I should say. This is a program that was, again, established by my colleagues, Kif Augustine Adams and Carolina Nunez, and they have made it so that the law school sends a group of students down there every semester to be volunteers at this pro bono project. So you have to prove a lot to get asylum. As I said, you have to prove that there's a credible fear of serious harm, that harm is based on some attribute, race, religion, political opinion, membership in a protected social group. You have to prove that your government is unwilling or unable to protect you from this harm, and that also you have to show that you attempted to relocate within your country. So even the initial interview is not easy to get to be deemed to have had a credible fear. The women we met there were very familiar. That was one thing that surprised me, was that they were people that you would encounter in any setting, even though there was this barrier of them having lived their lives in another country. For some, there was language barriers. Some spoke Spanish, some spoke, Quechua or other Mayan dialects. But of course, the children were familiar, and I could see instantly their dignity and value as children of God. I met babies. Before they got to the detention center, they usually spend a couple of days in what's called a dog kennel or an ice box. It's not pleasant conditions, so by the time they get to the detention center, most of the babies are sick. I met babies less than a year old. I met children of all ages up to 15, and they were all sick and had suffered a very difficult journey. The stories we heard from them about why they were fleeing their country were absolutely horrific. The brutality that they suffer and the lawlessness. They live in a place, many of them live in places where there is no rule of law, where society has devolved so that human life is not valued. And there's gangs running things that seem to have fully devalued the sanctity of a human life and the sanctity of a human body. And I will, spare you the brutal details of that, but suffice it to say that their lives had been brutal and cruel, and they had no access to protection by a government or the rule of law. I was forced to confront how vulnerable women are and have been throughout the history of the world in places where there's no rule of law and no accountable institutions. They made those life-threatening journeys, suffering indignity and danger, hunger, thirst, fatigue every step of the way, not because they're merely interested in economic opportunity, but because their lives and the lives of their children are in danger. And they seek sanctuary in our land, where we hope to uphold the rule of law, and we hope to hold our institutions accountable. They're our sisters, and they're in trouble. This week, I was saddened to hear a cruel president mock their claims for asylum, calling it, and I quote, a big fat con job. By the way, when I wanted to Google exactly what he said, I Googled President mocks, and Google had a long list of suggestions of things that the current occupant of the White House had mocked. I think one minimum requirement of our elected officials is that they comport themselves with dignity and refrain from mocking, especially the most vulnerable and powerless among us. Something I enjoyed, there was a story that the Cara Pro Bono attorneys, they're overwhelmed. They've got so much to do, and week after week, groups of volunteers go down there. They were feeling especially overwhelmed. One in October, right before, or the end of September, right before our October contingent went down, and there was one of the volunteer coordinators was sort of new, and she was saying to one of the attorneys there, I don't know how we're going to get everything. This is just done. This is just too much. We're not going to get through this. And he said, well, aren't the BYU students coming, next week or whenever it is? And she said, yeah. And he said to her, just let the Mormons do their thing. So they've got a reputation down there, and one that's well earned. By Mormons, I assume he meant members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So in addition to voting, we can speak out, use the power of our words to demand accountability, to speak healing, and to give voice to the marginalized and voiceless. We can also use our voices to help repair the fraying fabric of our society, to build connections and bonds on an individual and societal level. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. understood the essential nature of our interconnectedness. In his letter from Birmingham jail in 1963, he had been arrested for joining protests in Birmingham. That was the brutal sheriff, whose name is escaping me right now, but they had trained dogs to attack black people. They used the fire hoses. That was Birmingham. That was 1963. When Reverend King joined those protests, he was arrested. In fact, the African American citizens of Birmingham had organized a plan to fill the jails, including the children. I went there with some civil rights students a few years ago and met a woman who was part of the children's marches, and said that one of the requirements in getting trained was that you had to engage in this passive resistance, peaceful resistance, that people would shout horrible obscenities in your face, spit on you, and if you couldn't take it, you had to do something like maybe make the signs or stay in the basement or something. But that she was very proud of the fact that she could take it, and she maintained her dignity in the face of those insults, and was pleased to find herself part of the strategy of filling the jails. That was a great opportunity. Anyway, Dr. King wrote a letter from Birmingham jail in 1963, and he said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." I think that's why you're here. That's why you care, right? You've recognized that interconnectedness, that we are all tied in an inescapable network of mutuality, and we do have a single garment of destiny as a nation, as a community, as women. That's why we care about what happens at our border to the most vulnerable people. We care about the Navajos in San Juan County who want a voice in county government. We care about the refugees from Yemen and Syria. They're not a distant problem. They are us and we are them. We are tied in a single garment of destiny, and I believe our generation is accountable for our collective response to their suffering. Dr. King also liked to tell the story of Rip Van Winkle from the short story by Washington Irving. Rip was kind of a lazy fellow. When he went to the mountain and ended up taking his 20-year nap, he stopped by first at the local pub. And the story notes that there was a picture of King George III on the wall. When he woke up 20 years later and returned to the pub with his long beard, there was a picture of George Washington on the wall. Rip Van Winkle had slept through the American Revolution. And Dr. King would use that image to say that we need to remain awake for the great challenges and issues of our day. This is a quote from a speech that he gave called "Remaining Awake Through the Revolution." He says, "All I'm saying is this, that all life is interrelated, and somehow we're all tied together. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of all reality. John Donne caught it years ago and placed it in graphic terms. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main." He goes on to say, this is still quoting Dr. King about John Donne, "Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind. Therefore send not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. This realization is absolutely necessary if we are to remain awake in this revolution." That's a close quote from Dr. King. You being here today tells me that you're awake and you're paying attention to the great issues of our day, or as the kids might say, you're woke. Right? And that's good, because we have work to do. You may think, like I often do, what can one person do? It's overwhelming, right? There's so much to do and my sphere of influence is so small. Still, influence that sphere. Wherever there are opportunities to enlarge that sphere of influence, take them. This is the "let your light so shine" principle. Among my responsibilities at the law school, I teach constitutional law. One of the law school's stated goals is to foster an enlightened devotion to the rule of law. The rule of law means that the power to govern is subject not to the whims of the person who holds the power, but is limited by established laws and norms. Power in our system, first and last, resides with the people. The Constitution was ordained and established by the people, not a delegation of power from the individual states, but a delegation of limited powers from the people. Those who exercise that power are answerable to the people. The system was set up to guard against the accumulation of political power in any one person or any one branch. The checks and balances are checks on the accumulation and exercise of governing power and balances against the unrestrained exercise of power. It means we believe in equality, accountability, fairness, separation of powers, transparency, and citizen participation, many of the values that the organization here has espoused. One of the things my law students are often somewhat surprised to learn is that as powerful as the legal institutions are, especially courts, many problems are out of the reach of the courts and are designed to be addressed by people holding political actors accountable. That means imposing a political price for policies and decisions with which we disagree. It means voting and speaking out. It means the people play a critical role in our constitutional design and are a vital check on the exercise of power. The preamble to the Constitution is written in the voice of the people, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, that interconnectedness, that web of mutuality, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. It doesn't say 7 generations, but it means that, right? Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. In other words, we the people have a constitutional role to play. The lawyers might help, but they're not going to get us out of the mess. Some politicians are true public servants, and some are self-serving. We can't totally count on them. It seems to me we have to lift where we stand, as Elder Uchtdorf urged, in our communities and in our democracy. I was blessed with an extra wise and enthusiastic grandmother. I hope you were too. We loved telling her our stories, our good news, because she celebrated our good news more heartily than we did for any good thing that happened to us. She was generous with her enthusiasm. And it wasn't just for her family. I saw her celebrate with people in the community as good things happened to them, and she took genuine joy in their triumphs. I think it was an outgrowth of her capacity to mourn with those who mourn, that she could rejoice with those who rejoice. She multiplied the joy of her own life with this generous attitude and multiplied the joy of our lives as well. One gift she gave me is a kind of funny saying that when I would tell her about something challenging that I have to do, and I imagined her saying it to me as I was preparing for today. "You got the stuff," she would say. "Grandma, I'm going to do something, I feel a little nervous about it, or I'm, applying for a job. Oh, you got the stuff." So it is the message I would leave with you today. Her endorsement of my ability to meet the task ahead, I borrowed and leaned on her confidence in me in many situations. Although she lives in the spirit world now, I know if she were here, she would say to you, "You got the stuff." And finally, I will close on just the idea that we have reason to hope. There are 2 talks from General Conference that I would commend to your perusal when you have a chance. One from October 1999 with Elder Holland, a high priest of good things to come. He says, "Every one of us has times when we need to know things will get better." Moroni called it hope for a better world. For emotional health and spiritual stamina, everyone needs to be able to look forward to some respite, to something pleasant and renewing and hopeful, whether that blessing be near at hand or still some distance ahead. It's not enough just to know we can get there, that however measured or far away, there is the promise of good things to come. He says, my declaration is that this is precisely what the gospel of Jesus Christ offers us, especially in times of need. There is help. There is happiness. There really is the light at the end of the tunnel. It's the light of the world, the bright and morning star, the light that is endless, that can never be darkened. It's the very Son of God himself. So even though the world can be very difficult and it can make us despair, there is hope, and I do share that belief. And the other talk is Elder Uchtdorf, who says, have we not reason to rejoice? And from the October 2007 General Conference. Find my quote real quick here. He says, there will be days and nights when you feel overwhelmed, when your hearts are heavy and your heads hang down. Then please remember, Jesus Christ, the Redeemer, is the head of this church. It's his gospel. He wants you to succeed. He gave his life for just this purpose. He's the Son of the living God. He has promised, for the mountains shall depart and the hills be removed, but my kindness shall not depart from thee. He testified that the Savior heals broken hearts and bind up wounds. It's one of his primary missions. And so it's my hope that we will follow in those footsteps of the great Peacemaker himself, that we will share that light and that hope and that faith, that we will use our power of words to heal and to build connections, and that we will vote, and that we will be the influence for good that we have the great power to be in whatever our sphere. So thank you so much for allowing me to be here with you today.
There's a quote from William Arthur Ward that talks about teachers and the levels of greatness in teachers, and he concludes with, the greatest teachers inspire. And I think all of us who have sat through this lunch have been sufficiently inspired by the wonderful message that we've heard from Professor Steele today. And I think we also have some really great examples to look to with the stories that you told about when we feel like our efforts aren't making a difference, when we feel like they're not reading our letter, right? That we can think of that one Navajo woman who was willing to walk so far, or the tribe and what their efforts were in North Dakota, and hopefully use that as inspiration to not be beat down and keep with the peacemaking efforts of this organization. We have a few minutes. Do you want to have some questions for Professor Steele? Okay, we're going to go ahead and give her about 5 minutes of questions, and then we will give you guys about 10 to 15 minutes to kind of mingle, go to the restroom, do all those things that we do, and then we'll start our next block of classes at 2:15. Just one minor thing of housekeeping that I will conclude with today. After this conference, we will be sending out an email survey with respect to what your experience has been like today. Just about 10 questions, pretty brief, 1 to 10, how'd you feel, was it good, bad, otherwise. I can tell you that these water bottles that are on your table today are a direct result of a comment I received last year. So if you don't think that it's worth your time, please, I will read every email that you send. And I will do my best to incorporate that next year to make it even better and hopefully continue to have this event be a good one. So with that, please, when you see that survey from me within the next week, please give me your words, your suggestions, your feedback. It does make a difference. So I'm going to turn the time back over to Professor Steele, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
So I once opened up a lecture to questions. Anybody have any questions after what I'm sure was a compelling lecture about federal Indian law? A student raised her hand in the back and she said, have you ever done anything different with your hair? No, this has pretty much been my hair. It was a lot bigger in the 80s, but other than that, this is... So I'll just put that one to rest so you don't have to. You don't have to have any questions for me. It's okay. We can visit, and that's some of the most productive.
I have a quick one.
Yeah.
If we want to do more to support what's going on with the CARA project, what should we do? How can we help?
Yeah, the CARA Pro Bono project, if you just Google that, you can find them. They are there on the ground wherever there are people being detained at the border, and they are the legal advocates. I'll tell you really quickly. They had us asking everyone we met if their children were sick, which was everyone, did they go to the clinic and did they receive adequate help? And so I asked everyone, and one lady said to me, I went to the clinic and they told me my baby is too small because he's 6 months old, too small to give medicine, and so they just sent me away. And so they had an email that was an advocate who wanted to collect this information. I typed up, they sent this baby away. She said, "Are you sure that baby was under a year? Because they're not supposed to be detaining babies that are under a year." I said, "Yes, it was a small baby." They sent out an email, "Everyone, be on the lookout for small babies. They're not supposed to be detaining babies less than a year." And we found out that there were several babies there. They filed a lawsuit the next week to try to, they can take people through their immigration process without them being in an institution of detention, and especially where they don't have the means to care for them physically. So all that to say that CARA Pro Bono project is there on the ground. They're the eyes and ears. There's volunteers. You can go down there and volunteer. I think if they need you to go for a week the first time so you can really get the hang of it. They train you. Spanish is very helpful, but if you have an interpreter available by phone, that can work too. Other languages are helpful. And so volunteer, they need money and they need volunteers. Yeah.
How can we be better advocates for tribes and indigenous?
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think on reservations. And
Yeah.
things.
I think just including them in your thinking, right? Recognizing that they're there. I like to tell the story of being interviewed by a little girl who was doing a project about the Seneca Indians, whatever elementary school age that was. And she called me up, cute as a button, and she said, "When you were a Seneca Indian, what was that like? What did you eat and what did you wear?" And so it helps me understand that there's sort of a general sense that Indigenous people are a relic of the past and that they're not a vibrant part of the future. And so including in the conversation, I see news reports that talk about the Bears Ears controversy, and they say the locals oppose Bears Ears. And I say, well, the tribes are pretty local too, so they don't. I know they have split opinions. I'm not trying to weigh in on Bears Ears, but the tribes are local in the San Juan County area, and so it's easy to let them be erased. So that erasure is one thing where you can be an ally. And what about the tribes in any setting? Yeah.
So I've read a little bit of rhetoric about, I don't know, is law school like dying or like losing, there's like stuff about not being able to get jobs and stuff. And so for young people who have interest in law school, what are your thoughts on it today?
Well, my guess is that there's somebody at the New York Times who didn't get into law school, or I don't know, because I see that article written a lot. There was a decline in applicants to law school. It's ticking back up. I say if you want to go to law school, it's a fabulous credential. It opens a lot of doors in a lot of directions for things you want to do. It magnifies your ability to be an advocate and to be effective, and I say do it. Yeah.
Could you speak just a little bit to your experience working with Larry
Uh-huh. Sure. So I was at the Department of Justice working in civil rights very happily. So but I had a lot of DC experience. When President Obama nominated Larry Echohawk to be the Assistant Secretary for Interior, Larry asked me to come over. I will say this about him, that I was used to being in DC and being around what we call principals. You know, principals who are the men or women who hold office, and they're kind of backslappy, and they're not down in the details of stuff, but they just want to make the connection, right? They're politicians. And it was very unusual to watch him work because he didn't have any of that. He had an abiding humility. He didn't need to be sort of the big man in the room. He was quiet, he listened, and that had its own leadership power. But it was not something I had seen in Washington before. So where people sort of walk in with a big energy and you know, brush off the details of something and delegate it to staff. He was interested in the details, and he brought a really quiet humility. I saw one back there, and then we'll finish up.
I remember studying or something a while back about Native Americans, like some of their lands are their own land. I'm like, what am I trying to say? You know what I mean? How does that work as far as rights?
Mm-hmm. Well, I encourage you to enroll in law school and take federal Indian law, where we will spend a semester discussing that. But no, the tribes have lands that are separate and apart. Most of them are held in trust by the federal government for the benefit of the tribes. That means the tribes are the government for those pockets of land for the most part. They have authority over people and territory. And so the land status varies widely by tribe. Whether it is held in trust or whether it's private land within exterior boundaries of a reservation. A reservation means that a treaty was negotiated. For the most part, it means this. There's exceptions. A treaty was negotiated, and the tribes reserved everything they didn't give away, specifically in a treaty. And so usually it's a lot of land that gets taken, and they have reserved for themselves certain lands. And so we call that a reservation of land, but there's also all kinds of rights and that were also reserved. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.